The sounds you are about to hear do not come from a torture chamber. They come from a laboratory at Yale University.
This will be at 3:30.
An ordinary man is giving a deadly dose of electricity to a total stranger. His fingers are not on a trigger. He is only pressing a simple switch. He does not feel any hate for the man. He does not even know him. He is simply obeying the man in the white coat. That man tells him, "You have no other choice. You must go on." And the worst part? Soon, that person will be you. Because this is a story that tests the limits of ordinary people. This experiment did not begin in a laboratory. It began in a courtroom. To understand why, we must first look at the words of a Nazi officer. He was the man behind the deaths of millions. His name was Adolf Eichmann. In court, everyone expected to see a monster. Instead of a monster, they saw a man who looked like a simple bureaucrat. His entire defense was based on only one sentence: "I was just following orders." Stanley Milgram came from a Jewish family. He had lost many of his relatives in the Holocaust. Because of this, he was deeply affected by Adolf Eichmann's defense. He could not stop thinking about the idea of an ordinary bureaucrat. He asked himself a difficult question: how far will a person go just because they are following orders? He decided to find the answer. He did not look for the answer in books. He chose to test real human behavior. 3 months after the Eichmann trial, one of the most disturbing experiments in history began with a simple newspaper advertisement. The ad said, "Volunteers wanted for a memory study. The participants were ordinary people. They included everyone, from those who did not finish school to those with a PhD." When the participants entered the room, a serious and calm authority figure in a white coat met them. The first step was to build trust. They received their payment immediately, before the experiment even started. This was a silent way of saying, "You do not have to stay here. Your money is already guaranteed." There were 3 basic roles in the experiment: the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner. The roles were decided by drawing lots. The participant picked one of the 2 slips of paper and saw that he was the teacher. The other volunteer became the learner. The room was divided into 2 parts. The learner was taken to the next room and strapped into a chair that looked like an electric chair. His arms were tied down to prevent him from escaping. The teacher was then given a sample shock of 45 volts. This small sting was a reference point for the pain he was about to give to the other man. In the final step, the teacher and the learner were placed in separate rooms. Because of the wall between them, they could not see each other. However, they could still hear each other's voices. You are now in the teacher's room. In front of you stands a massive machine. It has 30 switches, ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts. The switches are labeled to show the intensity of the pain, starting from slight shock. These labels continue until they reach danger, severe shock. The final 2 switches have no words, only the letters XXX. Now, you are the teacher. The experimenter gives you a list of word pairs to teach the learner. You begin by reading the entire list to him one time so he can memorize them. Then, the test starts. You read the first word of each pair and give the learner 4 options. The learner presses a button to give his answer. If the answer is wrong, you must give him an electric shock. For every mistake, you must increase the power by 15 volts. If the answer is correct, you simply move to the next word pair without giving a shock. You start reading the options, and as the learner makes mistakes, you increase the voltage. At 75 volts, you begin to hear the first groans of pain from the next room. At 150 volts, the learner shouts louder and mentions his heart condition.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
By 300 volts, you hear him pounding on the wall. He refuses to answer anymore and screams in pain.
That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30.
Ow!
The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of here.
boy.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here.
At 345 volts, the room goes quiet. You hear nothing. He is no longer complaining, and he is not answering your questions. It is a deathly silence.
You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me out.
fast,
Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
bird,
Let me out.
car, train, plane.
Yet, the experiment continues, and that silence follows you all the way to 450 volts. In the heavy silence after 345 volts, you start to sweat. The learner is no longer answering your questions. You turn to the experimenter and say, "Someone must check on him. Something is wrong." But the experimenter remains cold. Ignoring the silence, he says calmly, "Treat no answer as a wrong answer, and increase the voltage."
Continue, teacher. That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast, bird. The next one,
Many participants wanted to stop at this point. Once they were told they weren't responsible, they pushed the switches again. They showed signs of extreme stress, shaking, sweating, and nervous laughing. What kept them going was the experimenter's cold, mechanical voice. The man in the white coat had 4 commands to make them obey. Please continue, or please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on.
As I said, the experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
I'm not going to go any further.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Yeah, I'm not going to do it though.
If you were a hero who could still say no after the 4th command, the experiment was stopped. But for most people, these 4 sentences were a giant wall of authority that was enough to silence the voice of their conscience. Now, take a deep breath, because the man in the next room did not die. In fact, he never received a single electric shock. He was a member of Milgram's team, a professional collaborator placed there on purpose to deceive you. Those heartbreaking screams you heard were nothing more than pre-recorded sounds played for each increase in voltage. The drawing of the lots was a complete lie. In fact, both papers said, "Teacher, you never saw his paper, so you just believed him when he said he was the learner." You never had a choice. You were always going to be the one giving the shocks. Even the money you were given at the start was just a tool to silence your conscience. Milgram's real intention was not to test memory. It was to see how far you would go against authority and how much you could be pushed by someone else's command. The memory and learning cover story was just a professional cover for the human mind which did not want to face its own dark side. No one was actually suffering. There were only people who kept pressing the button while thinking they were causing pain. In other words, the only real subject in this experiment was you, obeying those commands, despite everything. So, what was the result? Milgram thought ordinary Americans were different from the Nazis, and that only a few participants would reach 450 volts. Actually, the psychologist he spoke to before the experiment predicted that only 1% of the subjects would go all the way to the end. But the reality was so dark that humanity would never feel the same again. 6 out of 10 people pushed the switch all the way to 450 volts, even while believing the man in the next room was dead. That was exactly 65% of the participants. Not a single person stopped before 300 volts. The most shocking part was this. Even the heroic participants who refused the final shock never demanded to end the entire experiment. No one dared to get up and check on the man without permission. Even when they said no, they could not step outside the invisible boundary of authority. This experiment was not specific to 1961 America. In the following years, it was replicated many times in Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, and across the globe. The result was the same every single time. No matter the culture, 6 out of 10 people went all the way to the end. The rate consistently stayed between 60% and 65%. Milgram's shocking study answered one of the darkest questions in history. You don't need to be a monster to do evil. The famous defense of Nazi leaders in court, "I was just following orders," was no longer just a simple excuse. It was a terrifying psychological reality. Milgram's conclusion was actually a warning to us all, ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. Before you close this video, ask yourself this. If you were in that room, could you have said no to the man in the white coat? Would you have stopped when you heard the screams from the next room? Or would you have pushed the switch one step further? 6 out of 10 people went all the way to the end. But what about you? At how many volts would your switch have stopped? Maybe that isn't the real question. The real question is this. In your life right now, to which authority are you already silently obeying by saying, "I'm just doing my job"? Because switches are not always in a laboratory. Sometimes they are in our hands every day without us even noticing.